So a very good afternoon to everyone. My name is Nikolai, working at Agora Agriculture, the think tank for food, agriculture, and forestry. A very warm welcome to today's webinar, which is held on the occasion of the publication of Agora Agriculture's first study, Agriculture, Forestry, and Food in a Climate-Neutral EU. This study was released 2 days ago, this Tuesday. And in fact, we are going to go straight into the discussion now. And for that, it's my big pleasure to hand over to our two co-directors, Christine Chemnitz and Harald Grete. Tina, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Nikolai, and a warm welcome from my side as well. My name is Christine Chemnitz, and I'm, together with Harald Grete, leading the think tank Agora Agriculture. It is a very special evening for us today because we are presenting you our very first study. As Nikolai just said, we have worked jointly on this study for a long time, more than a year actually, agriculture, forestry and food in a climate-neutral EU. Harald Grete and me, we will present the study to you or give you a brief overview for the next 25 minutes, and then we will have 1 hour for your questions. And then for the questions session, we will welcome our team leads on stage as well. So, Harald, I hand over to you for introducing the study.
Yes, good evening. Also from my side, I will present to you the first part, and let me start with a claim. Agriculture and forestry have a great potential to contribute significantly more than today to climate change mitigation, biodiversity, and other societal objectives. And simultaneously, sufficient food for the EU population and more biomass than today for the bioeconomy can be supplied. And all that can go together without increasing our in-core demand for agricultural and forestry products. Because that's often a polarization in many public debates. People say, well, if we become more sustainable here, then we produce less. And if we produce less, we will need more from the world market, and then we just push our own environmental burden to the rest of the world. Yeah? And we say, no, it's possible to not do that while becoming more sustainable here. And we show this with the study we just published, in which we present a future scenario for agriculture and forestry in the European Union. And agriculture and forestry stand in the context of the food system and the bioeconomy. And that's the way we frame it, because we say our core expertise is in this field of agriculture and forestry, but we are aware that agriculture and forestry are part of the food system and are also part of the bioeconomy. And we have a food team in Agora Agriculture looking especially at food demand and its effects then on sustainability in the overall food system. And we cooperate closely with other Agora think tanks, industry, energy, transportation, and therefore we also address the issue of how much biomass will be used by other sectors, so not within the food system, because also that has an effect on agriculture and forestry. We analyze the potential contributions in different sustainability dimensions by mid-century. And we initiated this study because we said, well, for many other sectors, energy, transportation, parts of industry, we already know the transition path. We have an idea on how these other sectors can become, by and large, carbon neutral. That's not really the case with an integrated view to agriculture and forestry. And one of the reasons may be that these sectors are complex in the sense that they contribute to many sustainability dimensions. Take biodiversity, for example. And they are, of course, conflicts among these different objectives. We also know that agriculture, for example, will not become fully carbon neutral. So we think that this is the first integrated study looking at these sectors, taking into account the variable sustainability dimensions. We published a study now at the beginning of a new European Union's legislative period, and in the run-up to a strategic vision for agriculture and food announced by European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen. So we realize this is an important point in time where highly relevant political decisions are made. With our study, we want to contribute ideas and concepts for shaping EU policies such that the sustainability potentials we talk about can be realized, and such that they are translated into income opportunities for farmers and forest owners. And we find that of core importance that we have chances for those actors where we expect that they deliver on biodiversity, on climate change mitigation, on animal welfare, on clean water, on clean air. Because if we don't translate this into economic opportunities, it will be very difficult to find support from those who have to do it. So this needs an enabling policy environment, setting the right incentives for agriculture and forestry, and rewarding the sustainability contributions. And in very short, we would say achieving these broad contributions to various sustainability dimensions, we need to use land efficiently, and we need to consume food, feed, and biomass more sustainably than today. We come to that in some detail. So what have we done? We developed to a large extent, quantitative future scenario. And this scenario, which is just one scenario, we would say is not a scenario where we primarily looked at whether it would be very likely. It is a scenario which is possible, but we have to do things to achieve such a future. Yeah, it's a future where we assume that the EU reaches its sustainability objectives. So the enabling policy environment will be in place, and opportunities for the rural sectors will be generated. And yes, then this scenario may turn out. This is mainly in the European Union context be somewhat unusual, because very often there are this three scenario approach. One is business as usual for the future. One is radical reform, and then you have a middle ground scenario, which is considered the most likely one. We said, well, we just show one scenario. We are fully aware that we could think of more scenarios. Other scenarios are possible. But we just, with this scenario, want to show that achieving many sustainability objectives simultaneously is possible. And we also show, of course, what the core levers are. We, for example, show that it will be very difficult to be ambitious on greenhouse gas reduction from agriculture if we don't reduce animal product consumption and production, if we don't revert peatland, and if we don't use nitrogen more efficiently. And with this, I would start to show you a core figure. And here we are. So on the left-hand side of this figure, here you see the greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture and agriculture peatlands in the year 2020. In the right-hand column, you see the greenhouse gas emissions from EU agriculture and agriculture peatlands in our scenario in 2045. And in between, in the middle here, you see the reductions. Well, those who are experienced with reporting greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture, you will see that this categorization is somewhat unusual. It's a reporting group agriculture, and then we add the agriculture peatlands, which are in LULUCF, but we would say they clearly belong content-wise. They are caused by agriculture, and that's why we add them up here. And the most important message is we can reduce by about 60% overall emissions between 2020 and 2045. Well, 60% needs to be put into perspective. One may say that is really ambitious, seeing the fact that over the last 2 decades, almost nothing happened. Greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture and agricultural peatlands have been quite constant. One may also be surprised and say, but if we want to be climate neutral by mid-century, how can we then still in 2045 have that much emissions from agriculture? We'll say, yes, agriculture will never be climate neutral in its pure emissions. We will always have greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture, because if we farm soils, there will be nitrous oxide emissions from salts, and if we have animals, there will be methane emissions from animals. But we can heavily reduce. And let's look a little bit at the composition and at the big groups here. So you see the purple one in the lower part, which heavily reduces, by about 190 million tons, so almost 70%. And this reduction in animal husbandry emissions, including the emissions from manure management, have two components. One is the reductions from mitigation technologies. So there are things such as methane additives. And the other part is the reduction of livestock, the numbers of animals. And what you see here is that both is important. So it's not about either technological solutions or behavioral change. No, if we want to be ambitious, we need both. We need technological solutions and we need behavioral change. A second component, wait for a moment. This reduction in production only makes sense if we also reduce consumption. That's a debate we often have. It would not make sense at all to reduce production this much and then consume as before, and we just get these animal products from international markets, and the emissions would be caused elsewhere. Yeah. So this production reduction needs to be driven by a reduction in consumption. On average, and we can go into detail in the discussion, but on average, we assume a reduction of animal product consumption by 50%, which is about 3%, slightly less than 3% annually. And we know that's a challenge in terms of food policy, and we know that's a challenge for farmers, for animal farmers, and a challenge for especially for regions with a high animal density. But we find this of core relevance because through reducing our land demand for food, we have space for other land uses, for biomass, for the economy, for biodiversity, for rewetting peatland. And in order to have that space, we need to be more land efficient in our food consumption. And the core element there is less animal product consumption. Policy options are, as you can imagine, complex. It's about using public canteens as a lever. It's about good education in schools, including free school meals, which are healthy and sustainable. It's about using price incentives, for example, through including animal products in an emission trading system, or through taxing animal product consumption as part of the value-added tax system, or through other taxes. So now I come to the second part, and that's the peatland emissions. And you see that they are reduced here from more than 100 million ton in 2020 to about 36 million ton in 2045. And you may be surprised that the peatland emissions are so important, because looking at this figure, we know that we do not even have that much peatland in the European Union. It's just about 2.2% of the total agricultural land, most of it grassland on peat, the other part arable land on peat, but it's responsible for more than 20% of the emissions, and that's what you see on the right-hand cycle here. So more than 20% of emissions from just about 2% of the land, simply because the carbon being stored in the soil slowly evaporates into the atmosphere if it's farmed dryly. If we look at political action there, we know it's of course an enormous challenge. It needs collective action because it needs to be managed at a landscape level, because it's also something which cannot be done by farmers alone. You need hydrological management, you need stakeholder processes, you need institutions, and so on. We especially also need to develop economic opportunities on wet peatlands. So in the long term, we think that this must be wet value chains. For example, paludiculture, for producing biomass, for packaging materials, for insulation materials in construction. And industry will demand biomass for the production of materials if fossil carbon becomes more expensive due to the pressure of becoming carbon neutral. In the short term, these value chains are not yet there. And we will propose that we have economic incentives for farmers to revet. This could be done through inclusion of peatland into an emission trading system and then grandfathering the allowances. It could also be done through public revetting payments. And then we have the last component here, brown colored. That's the emissions from agricultural soils, nitrous dioxide, and that's also a substantial reduction here from 78 to 47 million tons. So that's about nitrogen efficiency. That's about reducing nitrogen surplus, partially through technological innovations and partially through reduction also of nitrogen input in order to reduce the surplus. Okay, that was just a picture of greenhouse gas emission reduction from agriculture. And there are many more sustainability dimensions we deal with, and I would hand over here to Kine Chemnitz.
Thank you very much, Harald. And maybe you can show the next slide directly. Thank you. So I show you here the land use graph of our study. On the left side for the year 2020 and on the right-hand side for the year 2045. Because the other ecological potentials that we outline in our scenario are shown very nicely in this diagram. The potential to produce biomass to meet the increasing demand for the bioeconomy, carbon sinks that can be established and strengthened, and the creation of additional habitats for biodiversity. All this is closely linked to the introduction of woody structures like trees and hedges on agricultural land. In our scenario, woody structures are cultivated on 8% of the agricultural land. And you can see on the right-hand side this arable land and exactly where the pointer is now, this 4% lignocellulosic crops, which is like 8% of the agricultural land. This is ambitious and needs support and incentives. But implemented like this, fast-growing trees and other agroforestry systems would store around 660 million tons of carbon from the atmosphere by mid-century. And once fully established, they will produce biomass that can replace fossil feedstocks. And this could again reduce annual emissions by around 130 million tons CO2 per year. At the same time, the supply of wood from agricultural land reduces the pressure on forests. Data on greenhouse gas reporting from recent years show that the carbon sequestration capacity of forests is decreasing. And to stop this trend, we assume three key measures in our scenario. First is adaptation of the forest to climate change on around 1/3 of the area. Then second, a slightly lower harvest in stable stands. And third, afforestation. slight afforestation as well. As you can see on the left-hand side, we are talking about 49% of the land being covered by forests, and on the right-hand side, you see 51% of the land being covered by forests. So these measures on forest counteract the current trend so that the carbon sequestration potential of forest in our scenario does not decline further, but instead remains at the capacity of 2020 in our scenario. And in combination with a greater supply of wood from the agricultural land, our measures do not lead to more wood being imported into the European Union than today. And secondly, woody structures in the agricultural landscape and on the agricultural land also contribute to protecting biodiversity. So one challenge we address with our scenario is to enhance biodiversity within the EU, while at the same time not increasing the pressure on biodiversity outside the EU. So our aim was to outline effective biodiversity measures that have little impact on productivity of the land. Because obviously declining yields in the EU lead to higher imports or lower exports if domestic demand remains constant. So what is the basis for biodiversity protection in the agricultural landscape? Networks of well-connected habitats in the landscape are the basis for biodiversity conservation. And with an area share of around 20% of these habitats, such as hedges, woody structures, or even extensively used grassland, other biodiversity measures then take effect. So our scenario shows that less arable land than previously assumed is needed to enhance biodiversity in the agricultural landscape. On average, across the EU, we assume in our scenario that around 5% of the arable land is needed to ensure habitats for biodiversity, on an area share then to reach these 20% on the landscape level. And among others, this is possible if, as included in the scenario, 8% of woody structures on agricultural land are introduced, if the rewetting of peatland is implemented, and if grassland remains constant, but less intensively used. The protection of biodiversity is of great value for our society, but farmers are hardly rewarded for contributing to biodiversity protection on the market. This means that public funds must be used to reward them, and this can be done by the EU's agriculture policy, which includes that these funds should be used in a targeted way, exactly to reward farmers for producing or providing public goods. Next slide, please. Harald, can you show the next slide?
Coming.
It was of particular importance to us that we improve sustainability in the EU, and that this does not lead to increasing greenhouse gas emissions or pressure on the environment in other countries. So our scenario shows that the EU will import significantly fewer agricultural products by mid-century than it imports today. So in this, again, reduces pressure on global land resources, and indirectly as well may contribute to global food security. On the very right-hand side, you see our scenario, and on the very left-hand side, you see the current situation. So let me already come to the very last slide. The scenario we have outlined is a very ambitious one, and it's definitely not a surefire success, but it is possible if an enabling policy environment is in place. We outline several measures for the different aspects, for the different topics on food, on arable farming, on livestock farming, but we as well highlight 5 policy areas which are cross-cutting and which we consider of particular importance for the current EU legislative periods. First one is the climate policy for the land use sectors. Binding climate targets for agriculture and agriculture peatland should be agreed upon for the years 2040 and 2050. So far, these targets do not exist, and in our view, this is a shortcoming. Particularly, as Harald mentioned that before, as these emissions will represent large share of the residual emissions, which will then still exist in a climate neutral EU and which then will need to be compensated. So with our scenario, we present an ambitious proposal and say a reduction of 60% can be achieved. Secondly, the Common Agricultural Policy. I already mentioned that the next reform will be in 2027, and the course should be then set so that CAP money is used in a targeted way to reward farmers for the production of public goods. And this will need to be accompanied by a gradual phasing out of basic payments. Thirdly, an EU legal framework for sustainable food systems. Sustainable diets are one of the central levers of our scenario. This includes a more plant-oriented diet and a significant reduction of food waste. Fair food environments can help to ensure that EU citizens have the choice and better opportunities as well to eat healthier and more sustainable. We are aware that food policy is not a simple policy area and that the EU can only provide the overall framework. Many actions lie at the level of the member states or even at the level of the local authorities. And moreover, food policy is an easily to polarize policy area, and nevertheless, we highlight the many societal benefits associated with addressing and developing an integrated food policy. Fourth, incentivizing efficient use of biomass. The EU will revise its bioeconomy strategy in 2025, and one of the important elements is that the incentives are set in such a way that biomass is used substantially more in a material way and less for energy use. And finally, we promote or propose the idea of an EU rural deal. Rural regions can benefit from the transition towards climate neutrality. However, this requires investments in the support of new value chains, in modern infrastructures, and as well in maintaining public services in rural regions. Our impression is that such a focus is important in the next legislative period. So thank you very much for your attention, and I hope we can contribute to a productive debate. And I hand back over to you, Harald.
Yes, thanks a lot, Tine. So this was our very introductory presentation, and we would now take your questions and start answering. And would ask others from the team to appear on the screen. We have with us Stefanie Wunder, who is the team lead food in Agora Agriculture. We have Arnaud Brisaille, who is the team lead for land use in the role of biomass in the bioeconomy. We have Wilhelm Klümper, working on biomass use in the bioeconomy, and we have Niels Ole Blambeck, who is the team lead for cropping systems. And you already realized in these many questions and the Q&A which started that We are a large team at Agora Agriculture. This was produced together with 18 people, and quite some of them are here with us and are also have started to answer your questions online. And let me start to go through two questions here. One question by Mathieu is on what's your ambition level? How did you define your ambition level? Well, one could say that was quite ad hoc. We did not have a target in terms of greenhouse gas emission reductions or in terms of negative emissions. We said we want an ambitious scenario, but we also want a scenario which can be achieved. Yeah, and we want to have other sustainability objectives in our mind. And therefore we said we don't want to go to zero with animals because that's not realistic, because many people like to consume animal products, and they have an important role in biodiversity on pasture. So therefore we came up with this 50% reduction, which is kind of 80% on the way towards a diet which would be relatively close to planetary health. And the same for peatland. We said it's not realistic to revet 100% because for some land we would have other objectives for not revetting. So we assumed 80%. Nicola Gusti asked, what forest model did you use? And that's a good question because it also gives me the opportunity to just mention that we for agriculture used the well-known simulation model Capri, which is a model of the partial equilibrium model of the agriculture sector, which have very often been used by many research teams from academia, but also from consultancy and from the European Commission itself for many analysis. But those involved in such modeling know that Capri doesn't cover forest. And here I would hand over to Arnaud Brizay with a question on, well, what did we do with forests if we know they are not part of the quantitative simulation model Capri?
Yes, thank you, Harald. So what did we do? We were trying to optimize the role for mitigating climate change from forest. And when you look at forests, what do? They remove CO2 from the atmosphere through the growth of the tree, and then they store it in the tree. And when we take the decision to harvest this tree, then we can store it also in an harvested wood product. Problem is that between the forest, between the tree and the harvested wood product, we lose quite a lot of carbon on the way through decaying, through combustions. And that means that it is still a good option to keep some of this carbon in the forest. Of course, we need to harvest. Why do we need to harvest? Because we need to manage forests, and we also need to adapt them to climate change. So we have three main measures. So the adaptation, managing the level of harvest, which counter the forest sink decline. And of course, the third one is how do we use best the wood so that we have an efficient carbon storage, more in long life product, less in the energy sector. And one of our main, maybe if I still may, one of our main measures, which means diminishing the harvest, still brings us 13 million tons with only a 10% reduction. So that means some effort can bring quite a lot for the climate mitigation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Arnaud. And there are as well two questions on the mitigation figures. Peter Lemons asks, does it include energy-related emissions in agriculture, heating and machinery? And does it consider other carbon sequestration potential beyond peatland restoration, agroforestry? The figures presented by Harald Grete in the very beginning, this is really the reduction potential from, or the mitigation potential from agriculture and agriculture peatland. We do address other mitigation potentials very briefly in the study. So we mention them and we quantify them as well, but this is not like at the heart of our study. Like from transport, from heating, from machinery. Other is with carbon sequestration potentials. This is additional to the 60% mitigation potential. And this comes as well from the woody structures in the landscape, in the agricultural landscape, which do, as I presented before, have the potential to sequester the carbon in roots and wood, but as well to substitute fossil biomass. And there are other questions, and I would like to hand over one question to Niels, leading our arable team. And one question is, how is organic manure replaced? Mineral fertilizer, or just assuming that mineral fertilizer becomes green?
Yes, thank you for that question. Well, in our scenario, both organic fertilizers as well as synthetic mineral fertilizers are applied much more efficiently than today. That is done, for example, by technological innovations such as enhanced efficiency fertilizers or precision farming technologies. But we do not completely replace organic fertilizers, certainly. With regard to green ammonia synthesis, we do not include any assumptions about the defossilization of ammonia synthesis, because that is beyond our system boundaries. However, taking into account that 1% of global greenhouse gas emissions actually come from the production of N fertilizers globally, this is certainly a huge lever. So if you're interested in information about the market dynamics behind green ammonia fertilization and green fertilizers in agriculture, please reach out to our colleagues from Agora Industry, who only recently launched a global green fertilizer tracker, which helps you to understand the dynamics behind this very important process in industry.
Okay, thank you. Then we have a question on the ETS and whether we have thought through design options to address different emissions from agriculture. Yes, we did. There's a small chapter on the potential of including agriculture and agriculture peatland in the emission trading system. And we indeed would look at different emission sources differently. In very short, methane, yes, that's very helpful to price the methane, to include allowances from methane emissions from manure and from animals. For some animal products, that has the potential to make animal products substantially more expensive if allowances have to be bought. So we would argue in favor of a carbon border adjustment for products with a high emission load, say, that's mainly beef from ruminants and milk product. For the nitrous oxide emissions from land, we would suggest to take the nitrogen surplus, to attach the allowances to that, because it's the surplus which matters much more than the nitrogen input for the emissions. And for the peatland, we say yes, include it, but there we need time for adjustment. So it doesn't make sense from our perspective to price emissions directly such that farmers working on peatland have to pay for that, but we rather suggest that we grandfather these allowances, we distribute them for free in the beginning, and then this is phased out slowly over the next decades, such that in the beginning it becomes an economic opportunity for farmers to re-wet quickly. But the payments, in the long run, farmers would need to pay for allowances stepwise more, because stepwise we will also have opportunities for wet use of peatlands. And then we have a question which I would hand over to Stephanie Wunder, and that's about the necessary transformation in food. Well, how would we do that? 50% reduction in animal product consumption, that's a lot. With what kind of incentives would that work?
Yes, thanks for that question, because like indeed, as it was explained, I mean, one of the key assumptions that we make to achieve all these impacts for the scenario is like this shift towards a more plant-rich diet in line with like reducing food waste. So, but the question is like, how can that be achieved, and particularly since we, see relatively stable consumption patterns, and there have been efforts in the past. So, how should that work? And one important thing is to say in that regard is that food policy in the past has long really focused on providing information to consumers, trying to increase the motivation of consumers, but essentially also putting a lot of the responsibility on consumers. And what research tells us is that it's really important not just to target the consumer, but to target the food environment, as we call it, that does have a big impact on consumption patterns. So the availability of healthy and sustainable choices in, for example, restaurants, supermarkets, canteens, schools, etc. To also speak about the affordability, the prices, and then also to, of course, talk about like providing information and have work with the appeal of food. So also talk about like marketing, etc. So that is an important thing, that we address the food environment, and the food environment can be well addressed through policies. And this is a EU study, so we mainly point out the policy areas that are important to do this shift. And this is not just food policy, it's really cross-cutting. We see it as integrated food policy. And to mention some of these areas, super important is public food procurement, because here we can really use the purchasing power of schools, of kindergartens, like, municipalities have a lot of power, and they can tie that, for example, to dietary guidelines. So that would be more plant-rich food. We can talk about then on national level on free food procurement in schools, etc. So public food procurement, super important. Then protein diversification, so working on the availability, but also the affordability of these more plant-rich offers. And then I would also point out a third one about like a sustainable labeling framework. All that would help a lot, and can be done on EU level. But then last point, at the same time, we know that a lot of the policies we need are also on national level. And this is why we do see that food policy, as Christine Chemnitz said, is not just a tricky area, but also a relatively new policy area. So while for many of the things we talk about in the study, we do have agreed quantitative targets like on plant production, etc. products, but for food we don't have that. So this is why one of the 5 core elements also for the next legislative period is a sustainable legislative framework for the promotion of sustainable food systems. And there we could like establish the objectives and the principles that would then help us to adapt existing policies, but also set up new policies in line with these objectives, plus also ask member states to set up national strategies and action plans. And last point, what's very nice is that we've seen in the strategic dialogue that also there in this stakeholder group, really a lot of these demand side policies have been suggested, also those that I just mentioned. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Steffi. There's a question from Stefan Meitinger, who asks, what happens if consumption of animal products does not change? What about exports? Is it better that states outside Europe with more greenhouse gas emissions take the export markets? And very good question. What would happen in our scenario? We show that in one very nice graph where we show the virtual land trade as well. And one thing that happens is that we would, if we would stick to our sustainability, other sustainability measures, if we would demand increase, if our demand for biomass would increase, we would substantially more increase virtual land into the European Union. This is one aspect. So we would externalize our sustainability efforts to other countries much more. Is it better that other states outside the EU with more greenhouse gas emissions take the export market? So what we don't do in our scenario is we don't explicitly impose measures which reduce livestock production within the EU. It's translated from a decrease in consumption measures. And we would say, in parts, the consumption especially for dairy products, the consumption decreases more than the production, for example. So the EU becomes a larger exporter of certain livestock products. We don't consider that realistic for some other products, particularly poultry or pork production, because within the EU, we are talking a lot as well about animal welfare. We will have increasing animal welfare standards. To imagine that we will have increasing animal welfare standards, but then export substantially more with a reduced consumption level here, we did not consider that as very realistic. Let me jump to one question with regard to biomass. Or even two questions I would like to pose to you, Wilhelm. Two questions were there. Did you check the feasibility of your assumptions on future bioenergy demand from the energy sector side as well? This is one. And secondly, there's a question referring to lignocellulosic crops being planted on around our 8%, which we introduced in our scenario. How much biomass is this, and can it be used? What kind, or how can it be used, and how much additional investments will be needed?
Yeah, thank you for these questions. I'll start with the first one that you asked. We took into account future bioenergy developments, but not the ones that would unfold in a business as usual policy environment. So we took our assumptions from a study called Breaking Free from Fossil Gas, which was authored by our partner organization Agora Energiewende, where they took into account the many other defossilization options that the energy system will have until 2050. And mostly that is electrification, for example, for the transport sector, for a large part of the heating in buildings, but also other options for the power production itself. And so we actually project a slightly decreasing demand for bioenergy. At the same time, and now I come to your question, Hans-Peter, at the same time, we have additional needs for biomass in other sectors where these alternatives don't exist. And that is first and foremost anything having to do with biomass as materials. So the construction sector, where we have a classical use of biomass, but then also biomass as a feedstock in the chemical industry. And of course, just in the latter one, for example, we have huge needs for transformation and for investments which are not at the core of our study. But of course, political incentives and support needs to happen for this transformation from fossil feedstocks to bio-based feedstocks to occur. So overall, in our scenario, the biomass that is produced on agricultural land will be taken up, or we project it to be taken up by the other sectors within the EU. We do not export that. And with that, we also spare the forest. Arnaud mentioned that we want to spare part of the forests to actually provide an additional carbon sink. And so we enable this by supplying around 580 terawatt hours, and that's around, let's say, 20 to 25% of the current bioenergy supply. The current biomass supply from this agricultural land. Or in other words, this is around 130 million tons of dry matter per year, for those who are actually a bit deeper into the numbers.
Okay, thank you. Then we have quite a lot of questions on pasture and how it fits together that we quite heavily reduce animal stocks, especially ruminant stocks for dairy cows, and especially suckler cow herds by almost 70%. How we can maintain that grassland with so much less ruminants. And the short summary of that is, indeed, we assume that the overall grassland remains constant. We don't turn grassland, or we only to a very little extent turn grassland, for example, into agroforestry systems. Most of the grassland is maintained, and overall the grassland is quite heavily extensified, used less intensively, and grass gets a quite higher share in feeding ruminants, and that has to do with the fact that, well, if we have that grassland and we want to keep that grassland for carbon stock reasons, and in addition we want to have the pastures, the grazing of animals on some of the grassland because of biodiversity, then it makes sense to keep, to a certain degree, ruminants. And that's a balance. We reduce the production of poultry substantially less than the production of ruminants, because it's much more feed efficient and poultry doesn't emit methane. But for the ruminants, you can integrate it in the agricultural landscape, and we do not have massive alternatives for the grassland use. Maybe one question there, which is the question about the carbon cycle. Somebody says, well, look, methane is short-lived, and as it's so short-lived, it doesn't really matter because it doesn't accumulate in the atmosphere. And that's indeed very different from carbon dioxide, which has a high lifetime and therefore accumulates in the atmosphere. Methane doesn't accumulate, but reducing livestock substantially, reducing ruminants substantially, would reduce the overall level of methane in the atmosphere. And that would, of course, be beneficial in terms of climate change. And yes, the life cycle is short, but it's especially the next 2 decades which matter a lot on this path towards climate neutrality, the next 3 decades. You also, Matthias Everinghoff, here raised the issue on whether farmers shouldn't be paid because the cows get carbon out of the atmosphere through eating grass. And if you do the math and calculate the carbon storage on pasture, and you compare it to the methane emissions, then the methane emissions outweigh this carbon storage, this grassland serving as a sink. So you need, in addition, the biodiversity argument to argue for keeping the ruminants. And that's, of course, a matter of negotiation then. We think that it makes sense to have a price on ruminants, because it will also make the product slightly more expensive, and that would be an incentive to consume somewhat less, and that makes sense. It would only work, of course, with carbon border adjustment. Okay, then let's return to food. How close are we to the planetary health diet, Stephanie? And to what extent and why do we deviate from the planetary health diet?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I mean, this for those who are like interested in detail, I can also like recommend our annex that you probably haven't had a look after the 212 pages of the study. But indeed, I mean, what is important to know is that we have worked with the planetary health diet and the composition, but we have made a number of changes, and one important one is that we also take into account current consumption patterns. Which is also, you know, weighted with like 20%. So you will find slightly higher numbers in terms of animal products compared to the planetary health diet. So that would be one important deviation.
Thank you, Steffi. Two questions I would like to answer. There's one question, how did you account for land loss due to photovoltaic, buildings, roads, and so on? So part of this is just like a trend included in the Capri model we used. And for photovoltaics, we included as well a vision we took from our partner organization Agora Energiewende as well for the year 2045. And what we showed, or what we can show, is that even with an ambitious investment and investments in photovoltaics in agriculture areas, it remains relatively little land area in total. It is 0.4% of the agriculture area. You can see that in our study in one of the figures. And then there's a question on climate change as a global issue, and EU ambitious climate policy cannot transfer the global agriculture and food system alone. How are Europe's partners around the globe considered in the advocacy process of the study? Very good question. And I must say, up to now, we focused a lot in our stakeholder dialogues on rather member states level or EU level, and have not yet included stakeholder processes beyond the EU. This can be interesting. We started an intensive dialogue process already before publishing the study, so already with our preliminary results. Last year in December, we started the stakeholder dialogue, but up to now, mostly on member states level and EU level. But obviously, and maybe we can give some interesting insights as well for the global debate. Niels, one question for you. How did we consider more insecure and decreasing yields because of increasing weather extremes?
That is a very important question, because certainly climate change will have an impact on yields in European agriculture. And then looking at the concrete effects on our arable systems, we have to differentiate between different production systems and regions. So overlooking the scientific literature, the opportunities for arable farming and crop yields in temperate climate regions of the EU, especially Northern Europe, the positive yield effects predominate. But very often these are contingent on investments both in nutrient management and irrigation. However, the situation for Southern Europe is different. So Southern Europe is already particularly hit by soil degradation, climate change, and also especially with regard to the scarcity of water. And therefore, in the overall picture, negative yield projections predominate in the scientific literature. So we will have to take a differentiated look into the effects of climate change on our arable systems. However, since you mentioned extreme weather events, these are projected for all European regions, and certainly this is always a threat. So this applies both to droughts, to extreme precipitation, to hail, and also to late frosts. So certainly for many production systems, especially for fruit and vegetable productions, this is a huge challenge.
Thank you. Let me also shortly say one or two sentences to the question of Christina Backhaus, because, I mean, as Tine said, we address the German and the European policy process. If one travels in the global south and talks to people there and works on agricultural systems there, I think it can quickly turn into being very paternalistic if one starts talking about maintaining carbon stock in the global south. And that's the more the case, less convincing the own action is. I mean, at a continent where a lot of the deforestation has already taken place a long time ago. So therefore, probably what I would consider the most important thing in terms of other countries, well, we have to do our homework. Yeah, we cannot convincingly argue for addressing climate change ambitiously elsewhere if we do not address climate change ambitiously. Technically, there are differences mainly according to income level, according to the level of peatland being available, but the most important story is our green or scarce emissions per capita are very high if you compare them globally, especially if you compare them to the global south. So we have to do our homework to be a discussion partner at all at a global level. There are quite some questions about funds. One question is no additional funds, question mark, and there's a nicely coined question. Is there any economic issue that makes this scenario a business model for farmers, question mark, or don't you care about it, question mark, Stefan Meitinger. Thanks a lot for posing this question bluntly. Of course we care a lot, and we are aware that even if this transformation doesn't turn into business models, it's not going to happen, because it's not convincing to stand there as a society and say, please become more animal friendly. Please become more biodiverse in your production systems. Please store carbon in the natural system for us, and please reduce your emissions. And then the story would end. It would make no sense. And we find economic opportunities enormously important. And you will find in the study quite some long lists of suggestions on how economic opportunities could be opened. That's quite often through the mechanism of public payments for public goods. We all know that certain goods can't be sold well on the private market. And as economists, we call them public goods, and we call the mechanisms at hand market failure. You try to sell milk by putting a sentence on the packaging of the milk saying this milk was produced while maintaining a high level of biodiversity. And then you try to get 20 € more for the liter of milk. And you know that this only happens in very small market niches. And we do see limited potential for what is often called fair prices, in the sense of increasing domestic prices, because we are integrated in global markets. And the EU prices for the main crops, and to quite some extent also for animal products, are made at the world market. Therefore, we would say public payments for public goods, it's an old story, but it's still a valid story. We need that in order to reward farmers, to reward forest owners for the things we want to have. And then there's a second big case for economic opportunities, and that's about the changing carbon price, which makes it attractive to come with biomass instead of fossil resources. But that still needs to develop. The carbon price needs to increase, the pressure on decarbonization of other sectors, and that will generate demand, and that demand will translate into higher prices for biomass. In many places of the study, we did some very rough estimates on what that potential could be, which could be gained by farmers, by forest owners, by offering such public services. And let me then jump to forests, and I would hand over to Arnaud. There are two questions here. One is saying that or asked, do we assume or are we in conflict with the EU emission targets for LULUCF, which may be too ambitious for 2030 because the forests may not perform as well as envisaged. And I know indeed we see it critical to be too overly ambitious in the targets without having underlying measures. Because if we are just ambitious in the target and we store on the forest and we stop harvesting, then we're going to import wood, and that's not a solution. So what about our assumptions in contrast to current LULUCF targets? And there is a second question on forestry, whether the biomass from lignocellulosic crops can compensate for the reduced harvests from forests. Arnaud.
Yeah, so on the first question regarding the LULUCF target for 2030, first of all, I must say that we don't have a very clear path between 2020 and 2045. That was one of our decision. And if we maintain the level of the forest sink at the current level, that means that we might not be in a position to reach the LULUCF target in 2030. But we do that exactly for the reason you were mentioning, Harald. It's because we try to have a rather prudent approach. The thing is that we don't know exactly what will be the effect of climate change on the forest, on the growth first, and also on the disturbances. And it was for us a more reasonable approach than to take a very prudent approach on forest, knowing that some other scenarios look at forest with a much more optimistic view. On the other hand, if you look at the different scenarios that are developed and considered as valid by the European Scientific Advisory Board on Climate Change, we are in the range, and maybe not in the higher range, but with all our measures in the way where forest and natural things in general can contribute heavily to reach the LULUCF target. Thank you. And there was a second question. Do we, with our scenario, compensate the reduction of the forest harvest? We do by the establishment of lignocellulosic crops and especially of fast-growing trees. We overcompensate the harvest reduction quite a bit because we have an overall demand for woody biomass, which is of the increase of 30%, nearly 30%. So we do overcompensate, and we also try to use in a more efficient way the forestry biomass, especially for the construction. I think it was mentioned in the question.
Thank you, Arnaud. And I have a question for Niels as well, from Hans-Peter Schons. If we would simply assume that the share of organic production would increase year by year, like it did over the last decade or so, how much would that scenario differ from what you have projected? And then the question is, which share of organic production do you foresee for 2045?
Thank you also for that question. We do not set any development trends for organic farming in our scenario. We do not differentiate between different farming systems, such as organic farming or conventional systems. Many of the challenges which lie ahead for agriculture towards the road to 2045 will be easier to meet for organic farmers, others not. Therefore, we did not make any assumptions about in which production systems and which regions organic farming will grow and how the yield gap to conventional farming will change and so on. However, we acknowledge that organic farming has and will have a role to play towards sustainable agriculture in the EU in the future, but we do not quantify that contribution.
Thank you. And this closely links to a question by Naoaki Hirata. What do you think about whether the expansion of organic farming will contribute to reducing greenhouse gas emissions? And there are many scientific studies on that. And you will typically find that if we relate it to emissions per hectare, yes, there are less emissions per hectare, but if you relate it to the product units, you are quite similar, yeah? So it may be slightly more from organic, it may be slightly less from organic because of the lower productivity. So organic agriculture has a lot of sustainability benefits, for example, in the biodiversity dimension, but it's not a suitable policy in order to reduce climate change. Quickly, a few small things. Somebody asked Judith Leisner, should financial compensation have an income effect or not? Hotly debated in the EU, and somehow I think we a little bit lost a clear sight by being lost in this WTO terminology of just compensating the cost incurred and the income forgone in order to fit the green box, and we have same kind of wording in a lot of for the second pillar. But if you look at it as an economist, we say, of course, we need to earn income with all kind of sustainability measures. We need to earn income with providing public goods, and many farmers do, because if we have a certain premium being paid, then only those farmers participate who say, yes, it's worth for me doing that. And then there will be what we call as economists the marginal farmer who says, well, for me, it's just break even, yeah? But for many farmers, of course, it's worth, otherwise wouldn't participate. And it would be much better, we think, to talk about that clearly, to say, of course, we must make money with providing public goods, because otherwise that's what most of us want when we do a job. Most of us don't want our employer to ask us what our cost of living is and then offering us to compensate our costs of being there in the morning. Yeah, and that's fair. We find that important. Tina, if you have a question to call, directly do that, please. Otherwise, I'm scrolling through.
Yeah, I was slightly distracted by going through the questions as well, but I hope you just didn't answer that. You didn't answer that right now. How do you envision the concrete implementation of greenhouse gas pricing in livestock production and peatland rewetting? From Hermann Lotze-Kampen. And we only open up options. I mean, this is all a very young debate now, Hermann. And obviously, from our perspective, it would be important to include livestock emissions and the emissions of peatland in a pricing system, since these are the two main emitters. And then one could imagine different ways of doing that. One option, for example, for peatland rewetting would be to grandfather the certificates for a certain period, and thus to provide farmers with the opportunity as well to trade these certificates or to lease these certificates when they re-wet early. So it would be, or it could be, like mitigation these emissions for earlier than demanded could be an option as well for income. What is important for us is that this should not be part of like a compensation mechanism. First, it's not a removal. Second, the focus should always be on mitigation. But this could be a way of incentivizing the early rewetting if you don't want to introduce a rewetting premium. And we discuss both possibilities in our paper. Pricing of emissions from livestock. One option would be to introduce as well a pricing system at farm level. We consider that as rather attractive, because then farmers as well would have the possibility to introduce like new mitigation technologies and could reduce their emissions as well, and then possibly as well generate income through less, or at least reduce their payments through introducing new technologies. And then there is one question for you, Wilhelm, which is, can you say whether a certain carbon price will bring a breakthrough for the agriculture turnaround? How high should that be? And I know you thought about that quite a lot, especially with regard to the industry sector.
Yes, thank you for the question. So your question already entails, Tina, that currently we have emission pricing, not in agriculture, but only in certain parts of other sectors. And that, of course, for example, in the energy sector, and that, of course, incentivizes using biomass there. The question of what is the right carbon price to achieve full decarbonization or defossilization, as we say there, I cannot answer, but projections go to levels of like 200 euro per ton of CO2 until like 2040. But there are a lot of factors influencing that. As for the agricultural sector itself, if we think about an emission trading system in agriculture, we applied a carbon price in our modeling of equally of 200 euros per ton of CO2 equivalent. But it is important to note that the greenhouse gas emission projections that Harald Grete showed in the very beginning, they are the result of a wide variety of policy measures that are applied simultaneously in the modeling, and which would have to be applied in reality as well. And you find them throughout our study in the different chapters. So, for example, a policy on fertilization and nitrogen surpluses, a policy on animal welfare would contribute, the food policy would contribute to a large extent. And so the question of what would be the right or an appropriate carbon price is not we cannot answer that. We know that if an emission trading system in agriculture is to be introduced, it acts through a cap. So you just limit the agricultural emissions and you decrease that limit each year, and then the price will just be a result. And I think the question one should ask is, what kind of support would be needed to the agriculture sector to not make that price per unit of emission explode, because then the farmer has to give up production or the consumers would face huge top-ups on their food prices. There needs to be support for the agriculture sector so that we can lower that limit in agriculture, in an emission trading system, but at the same time keep the prices for the emissions within reasonable ranges.
Okay, thank you. I go through 3 small questions, and then let me already announce afterwards I ask into the team, what do you still see where you would like to address open questions up to the end. First, we have a question here from the German Animal Breeders Federation saying that, well, you're not happy with the elimination of voluntary coupled support. And you talk here about sheep and goat. And I would say I understand that. And I think we would agree to something very similar. We would suggest not to couple that to the animal quantities, but to couple that to the kind of husbandry system. So I think talking about public goods, landscape maintenance with sheep and goat, so say extensive grazing systems, we would consider that a public good and would agree to a premium, and we just find it unfortunate if that is just a premium per animal. With sheep and goat, that's typically not so much an issue because they are typically not kept that intensively. But for example, with cows, that may be an issue. Then there's a question of Bernhard Osterburg asking whether it's not the case that grassland is overvalued by us, by saying something like all grassland needs to be maintained, because it's not all grassland which is very biodiverse, very high nature value grassland. And it's not all grassland, especially on mineral soils, which holds a high carbon stock. And indeed, not on all grassland do we have an accumulation of carbon stock. This comes to a kind of stable equilibrium. So therefore, indeed, we say it may be here and there on mineral soils that one turns grassland into a crop rotation, but then in a way where you integrate clover or grass in the crop rotation such that you get carbon into the soil. And very often the answer will be, if it's not so biodiverse grassland, well, if we only have half as much ruminants, you may turn it into somewhat more extensive and somewhat more high nature value grassland. And then there is a question by Mathieu on specifying more precisely how to deal with this nitrogen surplus. Well, the thing with nitrous oxide emissions is you don't measure them, you need a proxy. The current proxy we do in our greenhouse gas reporting is the nitrogen use. I would say if we include nitrogen use in the ETS, it's not that precise because not all nitrogen use is that bad. Yeah, it's the nitrogen which is in surplus, which tends to evaporate in various forms: ammonia into the air, nitrate into the water, nitrous oxide into the atmosphere. And so that's really the issue. But pricing all nitrogen use puts quite a burden on farmers, while we would say, well, the first whatever kind of kgs, as long as they end up in the protein content of the crop, we don't see the problem. And that's what we suggest, to have the allowances sitting on the nitrogen surplus, and the surplus being the proxy for the nitrous oxide emissions. And okay, now I announced before, whoever wants to jump in from our team, jump into the last, well, we still have 2 minutes, the last 1 or 2 questions you see. If that's not the case, probably then we are also very well on time. It's almost 7:30, and many of us have appointments later. So I think we still have some final announcement, isn't it, Tina?
We do have some final announcement, but not from me, from Nikolai. So thank you very much for all the great questions. I hope we managed to answer many of them in a written or a way or here on the panel. And Nikolai, I hand over back to you for your final announcement and maybe as well to get the full team on stage.
Yeah, thank you. So the final announcement is indeed that we are coming to a close of this event. And thanks so much for the great participation, the very pointed, interesting questions.
Thank you very much, everybody. And maybe the whole team, can you turn on your camera that everybody can see how many people have been behind the screen? Thank you and goodbye.
Thanks, and we're looking forward to discuss further with you.